What it's like being a cop in New York.
I heard a thump at the window. I looked out. There was a guy standing at the window with blood coming down his head, and he had his hands duct taped like this, and he was hitting the window with his elbow. What just happened? So I started to open the door, and the guy falls down and lays on the floor. So I'm thinking somebody just shot him in the head. I could tell you how many times you would have a major crime happen in the middle of the street. So you pull up, let's do a crime scene, and then people come running into the crime scene screaming, and you're like, get out of my crime scene, and the woman's like, don't give my car a ticket. So I'm like, this is your car? She goes, no, I'm across the street. And a lot of tourists come to New York. They'd hit you with this accent. You're like, what are you doing here? Why are you here? And they're like, we're lost. We're looking for the Statue of Liberty. I'm like, you're not even close to this. So my partner would say they're a walking 61. The reason we call a walking 61 was 61 was a complaint report, and usually for robbery and burglary. So we're like, they're a walking 61. If they keep walking around, they're going to get a 61. Yeah. You know, there was a lot of times we would be drinking coffee. We get the call of an address, and it's like next door to where we're standing. Just step outside, make a right, go upstairs. And they're like, how'd you get there so fast? We're like, we were downstairs. You're in the middle of a major crime again. Very rarely do you have a living person who says they don't know who they are. This woman just walks into a shelter and says, I don't know who I am. I have amnesia. Who am I? This woman with this story that she didn't know who she was went viral, went across the country. It was 24-hour news cycle, and it kept going. And then I would find out later on that those two women that were calling me, their kids were victims of a serial killer.
The I Catch Killers podcast was a fresh start for me, as I left policing behind and started a new life. Over the years, we've laughed together, cried, and shared some powerful moments. Welcome to I Catch Killers. Welcome back to part 2 of my chat with John Ferriso, former veteran Nypd cop. If you listen to part 1, we got a very detailed description of John's experiences when he was on the ground, not far from where the planes crashed into the Twin Towers on September 11. I've got to say, John, and I was speaking to you off camera or off mic, that just hearing the story from someone that was there, it really it brings it home. You read about it, but unless you're hearing it from someone that was actually there, you don't fully appreciate the magnitude of the chaos that went on that day. So thank you for sharing that story. And yeah, I think it's important that the story is not forgotten. It was horrendous. It changed the world that day, and it's something that's embedded in everyone's psyche. But certainly for a native of New York like you must carry it with you every day. Now, part 2. You're going to have to feed my fascination of what it's like being a cop in New York, because I've been fascinated by it. I love policing. If you're a career cop, you're always curious what's going on. You can go to different jurisdictions, different countries, and there is a commonality that we all share in policing. We can talk shorthand. We know the world. But there was something about New York that policing just seemed to be policing on steroids. Yeah, it was the good, the bad, and the ugly, and everything in between. So I just want to I want to read out something that you've written about policing in that other book you've created, telling stories, just stories about what occurs in policing. But this is how you've described policing in New York. So if we just start the conversation with that. These separate tasks come to you at random times, so going to work is like a roll of the dice. One moment you're driving with your partner talking about nonsense, and 5 minutes later you're coming face to face with dangerous people who just committed a criminal act. The way that these tasks become overwhelming and mentally draining if you allow that to happen. That's describing policing. The joy I found in policing was you never knew what your day was going to bring. You could turn up, you could be, some of the conversations, I think we should record some of the conversations between partners driving around in police cars, because they go in some wild, strange places. But you can be doing that, and I think it's to take the pressure off, because you know you're going to hear a bip on the radio, and the next thing you're going to be in some chaotic situation. New York policing. My perception of it is it's dangerous. There's guns around, and there's a lot of crime. Do you want to talk us through some of the dangerous times you've been in policing? Because we've all had it. If you're a street cop long enough, you've gone into situations where you weren't sure how it was going to play out. Do you want to talk us through a couple of situations you experienced as a New York cop?
Sure. There is danger there. And you're told that as soon as you get in the police academy. And they would show us videos of the horrible videos of cops who got, not just New York City cops, just cops throughout the country, that got
Yeah.
into very bad situations, and they would show it to you, and they would say, "This is the profession you're taking. You need to be careful. Which, when you go to work, you need to be alert, you need to be in shape, you need to be ready." And I remembered that we had an academy instructor, and they would tell. We used to call them war stories, and we wanted to hear the war stories. But I like the war stories because if it happened to them, it would happen to us. And they told us a story about how you need to be ready in the car. Don't just sit there with your head down and not paying attention. So I remember that police academy story, and then I had about 5 years on, and we were driving around, and my partner was talking about nonsense that had absolutely nothing to do with police work. And I wrote about this in my book. It's called At the Window. And he was talking, and we were driving, and then we used to have to pick up the prisoners' meals because the prisoners would hang out the precinct because this is New York City, the courthouse is busy. They're like, don't send your prisoners here, you keep them in the precinct. So sometimes they would stay there hours, and if they went into a meal, you'd have to feed them. So I had to go pick up a prisoner's meal because he missed the seeing the judge, and we had to feed him, obviously. So we were picking up the prisoner's meal, and my partner got out of the car, and I got complacent at that moment, and I picked up the newspaper, and it was before cell phones. I picked up the newspaper, and I'm reading the newspaper. To this day, I don't know what it was about, and I heard a thump at the window, and I know now it was an elbow, and I looked out, and there was a guy standing at the window with blood coming down his head, and he had his hands duct taped like this, and he was hitting the window with his elbow. So I woke up, man. The adrenaline just snapped to me, and I was like, what just happened? So I started to open the door, and the guy falls down and lays on the floor. So I'm thinking somebody just shot him in the head. And I'm like, well, what just happened? I'm looking around, and somebody comes running across the street, goes, they were just at the store. They all just ran out. So I'm like, who just ran out? What just happened? And my partner's not there. I got the police radio, but I still got to find out. I can't just start yelling into the radio. I got to find out what's going on. So the guy sits up as he's duct taped. He said that he was in the store, which was exactly in front of where I parked. I parked on the street. My partner walks across the street. He said when I pulled up, he was being robbed inside, and they were hitting him in the head with a shotgun because he wouldn't give up the money or the safe. I never got that full part of the story. And the other man that was there said when I pulled up, there was a woman in front, saw me and my partner get out, saw me. She immediately ran inside. I would assume she told them the cops just pulled up. As my head was in the newspaper, those guys ran out with shotguns past my car, or at least to the left of it.
Yeah.
He ran out. And so if those guys wanted to take me out in the car, shoot it out with me and my partner, they could have took my partner out without us knowing. They could have took me out. That's how quickly and how dangerous things were, where I was just picking up a prisoner's bologna sandwich, and I drove into a holdup where they had a guy tied up and beating him with a shotgun right in front of me.
Yeah, well, that is policing, isn't it? That you can let your guard down, but you've always got to be aware of what you might walk into or walk around the corner straight into. Do you get conditioned to that? I'm asking you, like you see, I know from my point of view the impact it has. How did you deal with situations like that? Do you just go, okay, well, I've learned a lesson now. I've learned something more. I'll pay attention.
Well, I immediately thought back to what the academy instructor told me, because he described almost the same exact situation, that cop officers were killed in a situation like that, where they drove up to a scene and they weren't paying attention, and the guys were already there, and they thought they were there for another reason. When I pulled up, those guys in that store probably assumed I was pulling up for them, when it wasn't. The woman ran inside and told them. I found that all out later. So I definitely learned a lesson from that. I'm not saying you can't pay attention 100% of the time, but you really have to keep your eyes focused. But I was just glad I was going home that day. And, the bad guys got away. I don't know if they ever caught them. I never found out. Detectives came and handled it. It didn't matter to me. What mattered to me was, because my partner walked out with his bologna sandwich in his hands for the prisoner, and I had explained to him what happened. He saw the guy laying bleeding on the floor. And, we were just glad that we were going home that day. And we went back to the precinct, and we went back of patrol duties. And, if I told that story to the guys I work with, they'd be like, wow, but it wouldn't make a difference, because they were like, you're okay, right? Don't worry about it. You made the report. It wouldn't be that big of a deal.
Yeah, we tend to move on. We had an incident, and talking about complacent, in the building I worked in, at police headquarters, where a person was waiting for someone to come out of the building, and whoever came out, they were going to shoot. And sadly, it was a public servant that came out of the building and was shot. Curtis Chang. It was a horrible situation. One Friday afternoon. I remember it clearly. But from that, it's sort of, we're police headquarters, it's major crime where all the detectives worked. And it sort of woke everyone up to the fact that, you'd go out to buy lunch and you wouldn't take your gun, or you'd do things and just drop your guard down a little bit. And it takes some horrific situation like that just to check yourself and go, okay, well, if I'm on the street, I've got my gun, and you get complacent. And complacency creates dangerous situations. Policing isn't all bad. It's not all scary. I think every working cop has some funny stories or funny experiences or things that you've seen, and you just think, I can't be seeing this. This is just ridiculous. And they don't have to be horrific. Sometimes they're just bizarre situations. I'm sure working the streets of New York as long as you did, you've seen some strange and unbelievable things. Can you recall any ones that you want to share with us?
Yes, there's a lot of these stories that are funny but couldn't make it to the book because it happened so quickly. I guess in New York, we're so conditioned to just things happen very fast, and you just move on. And, you would just go out on patrol and people would just run up to you yelling and screaming about nonsense sometimes. And sometimes it was legit, sometimes it wasn't. Like, I could tell you how many times, like, you would have a major crime happen in the middle of the street, and there'd be the windows of the car would be shot out, and nobody got shot, so everybody ran from the scene. So you pull up and you're like, okay, everybody's gone, let's do a crime scene. And then people come running into the crime scene screaming, and you're like, get out of my crime scene. And the woman's like, don't give my car a ticket. So I'm like, this is your car? She goes, no, I'm across the street. And I'm looking at her like, you really think I'm gonna walk away from my crime scene to give you a ticket? I'm like, get out of here, lady. So there's just situations like that it's like, there are people that believe everything revolves around them, and you're there for them. You're not. I'm there for something way more important than your double parked car. I'm here for what just happened in the middle of the street.
Yeah, and you get there's a real big presence of police, uniformed police in New York, and you described that introduction that I was saying at the start of part 2, that you're a chauffeur sometimes, or you're giving directions. Everyone comes to policing. I remember my early days in uniform. I always get confused when you dropped in the city, an area you don't know, but everyone's coming up and asking you for directions, and like you know everything because you're wearing a uniform. I would imagine that plays out in New York a fair bit too.
Yeah, there was a joke we used to say, because New York is a very diverse area. You have like a lot of wealth and a lot of people that are not very wealthy, living sometimes right next to each other. And a lot of tourists come to New York, so there's no accent or language you've never not heard. And I would be just, in Midtown Manhattan, and you'd see these people wandering into a really bad area sometimes. Not in Midtown Manhattan, other areas of Brooklyn and stuff. And they'd hit you with this accent. And you're like, what are you doing here? Why are you here? And they're like, we're lost. We're looking for the Statue of Liberty. I'm like, you're not even close to this. So my partner would say they're a walking 61. The reason we call a walking 61 was 61 was a complaint report, and usually for robbery and burglary. So we're like, they're a walking 61. If they keep walking around, they're going to get a 61. Yeah. So the joke always was, why don't we just hand them the report and have them fill it out? So it got to the point when I had this nice old couple from the Midwest, and they were looking for I remember they were looking for the Statue of Liberty, and their van was out. I mean, they were going to get rolled. It was just a matter of time. So me and my partner were like, I told the guy, you got to get out of here. Come, just follow me. So we caravanned him out of the bad part of town, and we put him in the highway, and we just pointed, listen, get on this exit and you're fine. Just drive away. So like, you have the cop humor, you have to help people, but it gets to the time when it's comical, and you have to make a decision for something that's not even police work. You have to just be a good person and get the person that should not be there out of there.
Yeah. And look, I think it's important, and you've got to check yourself as a cop that you don't lose your humanity. And showing that little bit of humanity, that keeps you sane, but it's also the best way to do policing.
Yeah, it is. There was a lot of times we would be drinking coffee and we would think it's a quiet night, and like we get the call of an address and it's like next door to where we're standing, the next building. You're like, is this a joke? Like, do they know we're here? We're having drinking coffee. Well, like, we think we're in the same building, and you just step outside, make a right, go upstairs. And they're like, how'd you get there so fast? Well, like, when we were downstairs. They're like, oh. And then you're in the middle of a major crime again, and you were just having your coffee, and you're thinking, okay, I'm going to handle this situation. Everybody's alive. That's good. But, I got to get back to have my coffee. That was my break. And that's what police work is about.
Yeah, definitely. Now, New York had a reputation of high crime, and was it? And correct me if I'm wrong here, but Mayor Giuliani brought in that Giuliani, brought in that zero tolerance. Like we're going to basically arrest our way out of this situation, and so people were getting locked up for all sorts of crime. What's your take on that? Being a New York cop, did it work or did it backfire?
It's an interesting, because that's still, the ramifications of that are still going now, and I could do it. There were a lot of people talking about it, but I could tell you from experiences, because when I was in the police academy, he got elected as the mayor, and he was the no-nonsense, I'm going to stop crime mayor. And I was a New York City resident, and I remembered as a kid, my parents like, you don't go that section of town, you don't go that section of town, you don't go over there when it's dark out, you come home. And they were always telling us where to go and what not to do, and so I was like, there's no way this guy's going to clean up crime. And I was in the precinct, I was a rookie cop, and they were like, we're going to start arresting everybody who commits minor crimes. And I was like, well, why would we do that? They're like, well, if a guy's urinating in the street, check if he has a warrant, because that guy probably has been committing crimes for years, and he's never going to court. They were like, if he's urinating in the street, see if he has a warrant. If he doesn't, give him a summons. So it started to make sense. They started with the turnstile jumpers. And if anyone's been in a New York City subway, it's not hard to jump a turnstile. And so Giuliani said, you jump turnstile, you're getting arrested. And the transit cops started with that, and once they started with the turnstile jumpers, they were catching guys with guns. They were catching guys with serious warrants. I'm talking like murders in other states that came to New York, and if you're a murderer in another state, you're not that interested in paying your subway fare. But when they started arresting people for that, that's when the criminals were like going underground almost. They were going behind. The weed dealers started to go, on the beeper, through the payphone, and through they went inside. The prostitution went inside. So you had some old school guys who were like, you cannot arrest somebody for domestic violence. I'm like, well, they're telling me to do my crime. If I go to a domestic violence situation and a woman has bruises, I'm locking this guy up. They're like, you can't molest a drunk driver. I'm like, what do you mean I can't? He just hit 6 parked cars and he's passed out in his car. I'm locking this guy up. So it cleared stuff up pretty quick. Crime started to go down very quickly. There's also, people call it the broken windows theory, which definitely has that. And the criminals started to realize that we were not just going to go to the scene. Like, I would run into guys who just got out of prison, and they couldn't believe that we were harassing them for the things we did. Because they'd be like, yo, what the fuck, man? I did prison time. No one bothered me for this shit. Well, like, things are different now. They're like, oh, I heard about that. Like, guys would shoplift, and we're like, you're coming with us. But all I did was steal this. I'm like, doesn't matter. So we were locking guys up for shoplifting, and then they started to realize that, man, if I got a felony warrant, I shouldn't be out shoplifting. So it definitely changed the city. It brought the tourists back. Another place was Times Square. That went from the crap zone to people bringing their little kids there to watch Disney movies. That changed. I never expected that to happen. So
I was interested in it because when I was studying and on different things about policing, and the broken window effect is quite interesting, and I like the concept of that. Was if you've got a street that's a no-go street, so every city has them. There's graffiti, there's abandoned cars, stolen cars, smashed windows. You go in and tidy that place up, get rid of the graffiti, clear the abandoned cars, put lighting in there. I think that combination is not a bad way to approach crime. I know in New York that's where it sort of originated from. Did you see the benefits of that type of approach to reducing crime?
I definitely saw the benefits because I also lived in the city, so I noticed it. I noticed that nobody was breaking it.
You felt safe going home.
Yeah, that, and it was a lot of the petty crime. Like, when I was younger, I had this, it's pretty funny, I had my car, I was concerned with people stealing my radio because, they steal your radio is one thing, but you got to get your window busted. They rip the freaking thing out. These guys are like a chop shop guys, how they steal your radio. So I used to have this plastic thing. Like in college, I had this phony plastic radio that was like a $10 AM radio that I would put the plastic case over my actual radio.
Okay.
I was like,
worth a try.
And people would put signs in their car. There's nothing of value. Please don't break the window. So, once they stopped with, they started actually arresting these people. Those petty criminals, they really, I don't know where they went, but they weren't doing much. And I wrote about those stories in my book because I eventually went to a unit called the Conditions Unit. And what was interesting was we would take precinct conditions because, it's like the movies. The phone's always ringing in the precinct. Somebody's complaining about something. So somebody did statistics and okay, we're getting 9 complaints about graffiti. So they would narrow it down and they would say graffiti is happening at this building at this time, and I'd be in the conditions unit. They were like, okay, go plain clothes, go out and get graffiti. So we'd go out, and we wouldn't know who to look for, but we knew the location, and we also knew that the city was going to lock this person up. Whether they did prison time or not, it didn't matter. It was important that they realized, if you are going to get arrested for doing this, and we started locking the graffiti people up. So then the graffiti people weren't even really doing it in the open. They were either doing it late at night or where you couldn't find them.
So you think, reflecting on it, you think it worked, that approach?
Yes, it definitely worked, because right now they're doing the opposite, and it's showing.
Okay, so the opposite is and we're hearing it over here, like you're not going to police these minor offences. So, yeah, it's interesting. Another thing about New York policing, and trust me, I'm not sitting here going, oh, look, it's New York cops that are corrupt. Every jurisdiction in this country, every state police, federal police, they've all been through corruption inquiries. I was working major crime when a big royal commission came through in New South Wales Police about corruption. So New York is not unique to corruption in police, but because it is New York, a lot of attention is played out. What's your take on the perception of the past corruption in New York Police and where you're at these days?
Past corruption before I was a police officer, from the stories I heard, was pretty more rampant and more in your face, where it was more like there's nothing going to be done about it. And it was common, and then there was some movies made about it, and there was some real commissions that knocked out, I wouldn't say knocked out the corruption, because it never went away, and I don't believe it ever will. But the old school corruption went out the window. And then when I was in the police academy, they drilled it into us about corruption. If there's any police officers who are rookies listening to this, you need to know that police departments take corruption very seriously. They will put a lot of resources into finding out if that is correct, what you're doing. So if there's an allegation, they're going to look at it. Then it's not some burglary that nobody cares about. They're going to spend a lot of money and time to look at if you did what they're saying you did. And if you didn't, you'll get cleared. But people need to realize that corruption is and it's a feather in the cap. I don't know about in Australia. In the United States, or especially in cities like New York, it is a feather in the cap for the prosecutor to get a corrupt cop, which means that, look what we did. Look at our integrity. We caught this guy. And sometimes the corruption is minor, but it's there. Yeah. And it is a feather in the cap. They will put the resources into getting them.
Yeah, definitely. And look, if you've been in the police long enough, you've seen things, I'm not sure now. Like now, I think all police forces have seen. I can only speak for this country. You need to be squeaky clean, because you're going to get scrutinised. Because policing has changed. People, it's not. Don't worry, nothing to see here. The cops are here. That mentality's gone. Now you get scrutinised, but corruption was a part of policing, and then you had to navigate your way through it. I worked with people. One of my first partners when I went to detectives was locked up for corruption. I was shielded from that corruption, but that was only because I made it very clear I'm not interested in going down that path. But it is a difficult way to navigate through your policing career if there are corrupt police, and they bring shame on us all if they are corrupt.
Yeah, I wrote a story about that in my book where I had to navigate around it as a supervisor. It's called Welcome to the Jungle. It was minor corruption, but it was there, and it had to do with street vendors who were taking cops under their wing and befriending them. And, as a cop, just as a person in general, but as a cop really, we get a sixth sense, and you just know when someone is not legit. So I always felt as a rookie, I noticed this too, if somebody who I do not know, I'm talking a civilian, somebody on the street, if they're trying to befriend me, I'm skeptical. Why is this person trying to talk to me? Why are they interested in pronouncing my name correctly? Oh, I saw you yesterday with your partner. And you got to put the brakes on. You say, yeah, and you got to tell them, I'm good. Thanks, man. No, you got my name wrong. Don't worry about it. And then they realize, okay, this guy we can't approach. And those same guys will search until they find a cop that they can get to. And I think I have to tell them, like, I'm not that guy. Don't approach me.
That's good advice, John, because you got to be wary of that. Those people that are overly friendly to you, going for a drink or whatever, or someone just turns up. You're drinking with a group of detectives, and someone turns up. Oh, let me buy you some drinks and stuff like that. You got to be that little bit wary. Let's talk about missing persons, because I know that's a passion of yours. How did you get into that area, and tell us about what your role was in the missing persons unit?
Sure. Well, I said in the very beginning of the first episode, there was 2 incidences when I was a kid. So
Yep.
once again, I was still interested in police work at a young age, and it was 1979, and there was a kid went to school, never made it. I was 9, he was 7, happened here in Manhattan, Lower Manhattan. His name was Eton Pates, and it was a very famous case in the United States at the time. And this was New York City when New York City was dangerous, but he basically didn't come home from school. And it was on the news every night. And I was very interested in police-related stuff on the news, so I would watch it. But unfortunately, I was 9 years old, and there's a kid a little younger than me that got abducted, and they were basically saying this kid was abducted. He just never came home. So I would watch this night after night on television, and my parents were funny. They never said, maybe you shouldn't be watching these crime shows late at night. You're only 9 years old. But they didn't say that. So I'd watch it, and then something strange started happening. I was afraid of being lost. So because the news started reporting this as, they did the shock value, even in the 70s. Oh, there was a cab driver who saw a young blonde-haired boy with 2 men, and they were flying out of the country. So the news spun this story where this kid was in a pedophile ring. And I was like, oh, my gosh, there's creepy people in my neighborhood. I was in Queens, and I knew this Manhattan, but I knew this could happen in my neighborhood. So like I said before, I was getting afraid to leave the house. And I would ask my parents, if I got lost, would you find me? They're like, yeah, we'd find you. Who would I talk to if I got lost? So I remembered locking the doors. Even though it was a safe neighborhood, I remembered locking the doors, and I remembered still watching it on television. So the news kept going with the shock value, and they had a suspect, but it turned out to be nothing. So that stayed with me, that missing person story. So as I got a little older, I forgot about that story. I forgot about the kid. I remembered his name, Eton Pates. And then when I went to the NYPD, I was a big cop, and then when I went to the missing person squad, I said, wow, that sounds interesting. I wanted to be a detective, like I said earlier. So I got a specialty unit because I already did my time investigating police corruption. So they said, where do you want to go? I said, I was offered the missing person squad. And I was like, yeah, I could do it. They said, you're focused on one type of case. I says, no. They said, can you focus the detectives doing missing person cases? I said, sure, I could do it. Yeah. So I step into the office, and my supervisor says, okay, we have a lot of cold cases here. He told us everything we have to do. And I saw the Eton Pates photo, and I said, wow, that's this case when I was a kid that made me think. And I was like, my gosh. He's like, so he told me everything we're going to have to do with that case. And I met the detective who had it. I wasn't that detective supervisor. And then I'm going to fast forward here because I'm going to talk about other missing person cases. I ended up working on that case. And I ended up working on the same case that I had a fear of as a kid. And at one point, they were digging a basement in the city. And I was kept back from the dig. And I was a little not happy about that. I was like, I want to dig. I want to be part of this investigation. So me and one detective were kept back. And as we were sitting in the office, the phone rang. And the civilian came running out. She says, he knows what the kid is. He knows who killed the kid. So I thought I had another case of, which I wrote about in my book, but I have another case of a kid that went missing. So the detective wrote down the name Eton Pates in the paper, and that was how they solved the case through that phone call when I was sitting in the office. So the same case, there's a kid that scared me. I ended up working on. I was in the office when that call came in. That solved it.
Wow, that's chilling and interesting that you carry that through. I had some cases that I knew that occurred, high-profile cases, before I was in the cops and got to work on them. And it's something about policing. You think, how did I get to this point? It's good. It's great. Something that you've been curious about, and here you're finding out exactly what's gone on. Other missing persons cases that you worked on, because in America, I'd imagine there's a lot of missing persons cases. Majority of them turn out to we find them, but there's a lot that just disappear, and some are a little bit more sinister than just wandering off.
Yeah, there's a few that are sinister. Now, it's funny is I see it on the movies a lot. There's like that 24-hour rule that doesn't exist. You can't call missed persons for 24 hours. That doesn't. That's just anyone.
John, can you yell that from the rooftop? Because I get people phone me. I'm out of the cops, and when I was in the cops, and they go, well, but we can't report it because they've got to be missing for 24 hours or whatever. I say, if any cop has told you that, they're lazy, and you can report it. Like, just walk in there if you've got concerns. So, sorry, it's just it's a bee in my bonnet about that. I get so sick of hearing people go, oh, but we can't report the person missing because it hasn't been 24 hours.
I always wonder where that urban legend began. I don't know if it's an old movie. It had to begin somewhere, and there's no truth behind it, and people still believe it. And there are people who wait 24 hours to report their husband's missing.
I blame you guys. It must have been one of those New York cop shows that came out. Yeah,
Definitely. So when I went to Missing Persons, I was surprised with the volume of cases, because New York's a big city. You know, you get tourists, you get locals, you get everything. And so I was the supervisor of 8 detectives, and there was other supervisors with their detectives. So we'd get about 7,000 cases a year. So now it's interesting, is 7,000 is at a very low number. The reason I'm saying a very low number is because it would go to the local precinct first. And, people would call 911 and say, okay, my daughter ran away. And then the detective would go there, and then maybe they'd talk to the neighbor, and they would say, you know what, she's staying at the park, and they'd find her. So technically it's a report, it's a runaway, it's a missing person, but it's located quickly. So by the time the cases we got the ones that they didn't return in 7 days. So the precinct couldn't find them, detectives couldn't find them. They would send it to us because we were the experts. And 90% of them we found within, or I say found, I mean, there's unfortunately a lot of there are some homicides, but a lot of suicides. Yeah. And we'd find almost all of them, I would say 90 to 95% within the first week. And that's as in located. It was that 5% that out of those 7,000 cases that you're like, okay, something is going on here. There's something that's not right. And another thing that the media has wrong, people don't just fake their disappearances. That's very, very rare. That's almost impossible to do now, to fake a disappearance. And if you fake a disappearance, you're probably covering up a crime to begin with. So they're looking for you for the crime. It's not really you being missing. They're looking at you what you did for fake it. Nobody fakes their disappearance for no reason. So we had to look at those cases. But I got very good at quickly knowing, you can't judge it, exactly, but you're like, this sounds like a suicide. This sounds like a runaway. There's a lot of human trafficking that's happening too. And human trafficking is not really someone from another country. A lot of times it's a young girl who meets the wrong person, and he starts offering her money, and she has to turn tricks for him. And then she goes missing, which is the pimp takes her. She's making money. He takes her to the cheap hotel, and the mother's reporting her missing. And that's a good example of the 5% that, you have to find this girl before something really bad happens to her. And quite often we would. But that's an example of one of the cases that we had to spend a lot of time on with these human trafficking cases to get these kids. It was usually a female 15 years old. We'd have to find them and get them back.
And that must give a lot of job satisfaction too. I think stepping in and bringing some comfort to the families, or hopefully comfort if they can break away from what's happened to them. It's a very important role, missing persons, isn't it? Because the impact it has on families, you would have seen that.
Yeah, we did see it. We didn't always hear it from the family, but it was quite often when, we thought that this was an easy case. We used to say easy case, which meant that, you get a guy, he's binging on whatever drug, and, okay, we're going to find him soon, and he's going to be at the rehab, or he's going to be at the local shooting gallery heroin. That's what we would say. Yeah. So, you don't want to tell the family that, but you figure, okay, he's a junkie. We're going to know we're going to find this guy. And then, you'd put up a flyer or two, and then one of the local guys would just... because missing persons isn't a crime. You would get some people would talk to you a little quicker because they know no one's going to prison. So they would say, yeah, I know him. I ain't giving you my name, but he's always on the corner every night. And then you'd go to the corner and you'd find him. And if he's an adult, technically he doesn't have to go home. You'd call the family. He's on this corner. He's not missing. And the family would be very thankful quite often that we put that effort in. To me, it wasn't a big deal to find a case like that. It was an easy one. But to that family, it was very important that that person was located.
Yeah, well, they've come to the police for help, and if you can help them in that way. In your book, there was an interesting chapter about someone where missing persons, but it wasn't a missing person. You actually had the person, but didn't know who the person was. A 15-year-old girl, I think it was. Do you want to tell us that story? I just found it interesting looking at it from a different perspective.
Yeah, that's the first story in the book. It's called Even a Little Incident Could Go a Long Way. And that is, I would say, my favorite story. I don't like to use the word favorite, but I like to talk about that one because it was very different from what we did, because very rarely do you have a living person who says they don't know who they are. We'd get the local drunk who ends up in the emergency room hitting the head. Okay, something. He came out of a bar, he hit his head. We'll find out who this guy is. So this woman just walks into a shelter and says, I don't know who I am. I have amnesia. Who am I? And I was working that office that night, and it was just me and a few detectives, and I didn't think much of it until I saw the girl's picture, because they sent me a picture. I said, oh, no, this is going to go viral. Because I saw the girl's picture. There is Missing persons, there are people. If you have anybody that's missing, put the best picture you can of them out. That's all I got to say. Don't put the guy with the mohawk. Put him when he looks the best, because he'll get more attention. So,
I agree.
So you know what I'm talking about with that. And that's for a family. You want the best picture of the person out there. So they put this picture out. I said, this is going to go viral. I know it. So the detective called me. He's like, listen, my supervisor's putting this on the news tonight. So I said, okay, now it's really going to go viral. So I told the detectives, I go, when this hits the news, the phones are going to light up. We used to use the term light up, which means that's going to call. So we used to have a book to sign out. And it was always the ongoing joke as a supervisor. You hide the book so no one signs out and gets the heck out of there before you're told. They tell them what to do. So I took the book, and once I took the book, they knew it. They're like, we're pulling an all-nighter here. I could have called for reinforcements to help us, but it was just me and a few detectives. And then sure enough, the phone call started. And there was a girl that looked like her in a building, and we had to send people to the location. And it wasn't her. It was just another girl that looked like her, but we got a lot of calls on that. And so it wasn't her. And then as time went by, the detective called me back. He goes, my supervisor's putting it on a major network. Now, this major network in the United States goes all 50 states, all over the country, and probably outside the United States. I said, my gosh, every drunk amateur sleuth and wacko is going to start calling. Yeah. They put her picture up. It was like, who am I? Please help me find myself. I was like, oh, my gosh. And the phone call started. And we could not field the phone calls fast enough. And I talked to 2 truck drivers who said that they transported her from one state to another, and they described it pretty well. And when a truck driver calls, those guys are observant. They see what's going on. They pick up a hitchhiker. They're going to remember it. So those 2 guys described the same situation in 2 different states. So I'm like, I think this is her. So then we had all these amateur sleuths calling, and we found out that some of them just wanted to put themselves in the case and talk to us like they were an investigator. It got to the point I knew the voices. I'm like, stop calling. We know what we're doing. Yeah. Then the case got sad. And I say sad is because I started getting phone calls from women in California because they were getting phone calls that their daughters were missing, and they thought we had their daughter.
All the other families.
The families of the legit missing started calling us. And I had to do my own, cold case investigation through the computer. And I started to find out that, wow, these 2 women are looking for their daughters, and they're looking at us for hope. And we had somebody who claimed she didn't know who she was. And one of the mothers called me back and said that, no, it's not my daughter. It just looks like her, because we compared the photos. But I felt for those women, because this woman with this story that she didn't know who she was went viral, went across the country. It was 24-hour news cycle, and it kept going. And I was the lead investigator on it. And I pulled an all-nighter on that one. And, we had all types of people getting involved in that. And it turns out we found out later on who she was, because her father eventually called, because she wasn't missing in another part of the country. And then I would find out later on that those 2 women that were calling me, their kids were victims of a serial killer. And they did look like her, so they had the concern that we possibly had their daughter. And I believe possibly after I retired, the serial killer came forward from prison and said that he had murdered these women. So I eventually did find out who their kids were, but it was not the girl that we had with us.
Yeah, it's missing persons. Working homicide as long as I did, I saw the impact that homicide have on families, but also the increased impact when someone's just disappeared, where the families haven't got answers and they haven't found out what's happened to their loved one. And it's painful, and it's an area that policing, and I'm glad we've jumped on the 24-hour rule, throw that one out the door. But quite often, if you've got a good missing persons unit and set up in whatever police force or jurisdiction, it can make a big difference, because they are solvable if a little bit of attention's put into them at the time they're reported. And if they're not, if they just sit in a drawer somewhere or just on the computer and no one's looking at them, that's when they become problematic, when the trail has slowed down. What other areas of policing? You spent 20 years in the cops.
Sure.
Is this, and this is, again, I might have learnt this from TV, but that's a standard career for a New York cop, 20 years, and then you can retire? Is that the way it plays out, or am I misreading it?
Right now it's 25 years, but when I was there, you could do 20 years and retire. And most people do 20.
And that was retire, you've done your service, you go out, there's a pension of whatever, but you've done your service. Was that because of the intensity of being a New York cop 20 years? Like we don't have that in New South Wales Police. Like we can stay until we decide to retire, but that brings problems in itself because
Sure.
some people, a lot of people burn out.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think it was a good idea 20 years and now probably 25 because people are working longer?
I think it is a good idea because you do need younger people to come in and, the younger people that could do more. And I say do more
Yeah.
as in more physical, and they could do the hours, the tours. Although, when I left at the height of my career with the most experience I had, and I was at the height of my investigations, and I could handle anything thrown at me. But when it's time, you don't want to stay past your welcome. You don't want to. I started to get a little complacent again, and my head wasn't in the game as much. I figured I did 20 years. I wanted to start seeing my family again. I know you wrote about it in your book. It gets to a point when, the kid's missing. He's riding a skateboard. I'm looking at parks all over the city, but yet my kids are playing soccer, and I'm out looking for somebody else's kid. So it gets to a point when let somebody else take the reign and let somebody else come in and learn the experience. And it was time for me to move on back to the civilian world, because 20 years in the NYPD is a very long time, because I did 8 years of just straight overtime where I was working 2 jobs almost during those 8 years, and it's you're burning the candle at both ends at one point.
And it does have the impact on the family, doesn't it? And it's hard to walk away from when you're a dedicated police officer. You're on a case, and it's not a 9 to 5 job. But your family, were they happy when you retired?
Yeah, they were. Even my kids kind of said it. They were like, "Oh, you could be home more. You could do this. You could do that." And my wife was glad. She basically said that she didn't watch the news most of the time, and then I had to tell her how many stories I shielded from her that I decided not. She's like, "When were you going to tell me this?" I wasn't going to. I told her, "Why should I come home and burden you with the madness that's going on at work?" Because I don't want to upset. And people don't understand. My wife has family that are police officers, but she still couldn't 100% understand what I was getting at. And there was no reason to cloud her mind with all that. And even my own family, they would ask me about work. I would tell them the funny things, the funny stories, but I didn't get into the nitty gritty of the real politics that were going on, or the real. It's a Shark Tank. It's at times I used to joke around. I go, sometimes you feel like you're the goldfish with the piranhas, and there's a glass bowl. I used to say that in the detective bureau.
It's a pressure environment, and I speak to a lot of cops on this show, and know people through my career. A lot of us say, I can handle the pressure of the work. It was the internal politics that wear you down, because it is I don't know, it's the very nature of policing. It's a combative area to work, and it's funny reading stuff and preparing. You talk about the supervisors and this, and there's always a clash. It's a difficult area to work in, isn't it?
It's definitely difficult. I expected it. I expected more of the difficulty to come from the people on the street. I really got there thinking us versus them mentality. And I realized that some of the biggest obstacles were your coworkers or your supervisors. Whether they meant it or not, they were the biggest obstacles to you actually doing your job the way it should be done, or going home on time. And there's a lot of politics in New York City, because this is New York City. There's politics involved in police work, and it shows.
Yeah. Well, if you've read my book, you can see that I agree with that, and the conflict that you can have in the workplace. What are you doing with yourself now? You're running an investigation business?
Yeah.
Yep.
When I retired, I thought about getting away from all types of police work in general, and I got very bored very fast, and I realized that I went from a roller coaster and then was told to sit. And that wasn't me. So I told my wife I got to get a part-time job. So she's like, yeah, get out of the house, get a part-time job. So I think she was
probably glad to get you out of the house, John. I would imagine you would have been a pain.
Yeah, I had to. I'm not saying I missed the police work. I missed the excitement, I guess. But I was definitely glad we're done with the bureaucracy. So the first building was the first job I got was actually the Empire State Building. And everybody's okay, you just went to the second biggest building in the city. You sure you want to work here? So I'm like, sure. So I was working I was managing the security there. So I did that for a number of years. And then what I was getting was a lot of people were asking me missing person questions. They were like, John, I know this guy. And I'm like, listen, I haven't done missing persons in years. They were like, no, but you were the missing person guy. So I found myself fielding all these missing person questions. And I said, wow, I must have a lot of experience with this, and I shouldn't forget it. And I felt that if the NYPD gave me that experience and I had it and I lived it and I learned it, I need to put that experience back out there, whether it's on a podcast like this, whether it's writing my book, whether it's mentoring somebody, or a private eye business. So I did the cop route and I did the private eye business, and I didn't want to do the cheating spouses. That's like a big thing here where people are making money.
Yeah.
I really, my days of watching people in cheap hotels at 2 a.m, I didn't retire to do that.
Yeah.
So I turned those cases down. I know other people make money with it. I got some interesting cases during COVID where people were moving people into their houses and they were not who they were, and then they just disappeared on them. They tried to report them missing, and the police wouldn't take it. And I was like, all right, that sounds like something I could do. And it was fraud. They were definitely fraud cases. And so I keep gravitating back to missing person cases. And like I said, I network with a lot of private investigators. So I opened up a company, and I still do missing person cases. But what happens is another thing which I didn't expect is a lot of nonprofits reach out to me. I don't know if you have nonprofits there, but in Australia.
we have the same thing over here. Yep.
Oh, you do? So there's a lot of, you'll know cold cases are, it's not like Hollywood where the cold cases, everybody's focusing on it. The cold case, I hate to say it, it's in the back room. It's up on a shelf. It's got dust. And unless a call comes in or someone gives a quote, a tip, that case is going to sit there for a very long time. So a lot of these nonprofits will help the family. And I look at the old cases, and so they'll approach me and they'll say, listen, this is the information we have. And I look at it where I almost start from the beginning. I don't say start from the beginning like I get out there and do the work. I say, was this done? And I have a list. And sometimes I don't even ask totally about the case. I go, okay, this person was missing from here. Were all these steps done? And there's a lot of times, I could be honest, I'm retired now. The steps were never done. For whatever reason, steps were missed early on. I'm like, man, you almost had this solved in the very beginning.
Yeah.
Sometimes you can go back to those steps because there are people still alive, and you notice people will talk. I've had people on the phone from 50 years ago, and they're talking about it like it was yesterday. So there are people who will talk, and there are steps. Cold cases still can be investigated. And I tell the family that the chances of me finding this missing person, finding the body, or having somebody arrested is slim. But I can guarantee you I'll do the work on it. And that's something some of these families have not heard in a long time. And I do the work on it. And I've had, through this nonprofit, and something fulfilling for me is I've had one case reopened through the NYPD because I handed them the information that they needed. And I said, listen, you guys solved this. I'm fine with it. You need to reopen this. And the family got on them, and they got me, and I got on the investigators, and I had a case reopened. And there was another case in another state that's not even New York where I can't work on it, but they're pretty close to arresting somebody. And this is a person that got under the radar, murdered somebody. It went as a missing person, but it was a homicide, and they just need somebody to confess or talk. But they're very close to an arrest on it, and that's something that the nonprofit had me look at.
John, I fully understand that, and I've get involved in similar stuff since I've left police, and it starts with the families reaching out to me, can you have a look at this? Sometimes I have a look at it, whether they've got the coronial brief or the brief of evidence. I look at it, and I will say, in my opinion, and have a sort of circle of other experienced detectives and people from lawyers and different things. We have a look at these things, and if the police haven't done their work, I'll type something up and say, well, look, these are the things I think should be done. I try not. I want to work with the police. I don't want conflict. You don't want to go, hey, you guys stuff this up. I'm saying this can be helped, but it is rewarding. So I'm going from this podcast to have a look at brief of evidence that the families sent to me, and again, it was just a matter where someone was written off as a suicide, and they've got some doubts. I don't know if it is or isn't, but I'll look through the brief, and to me, I'm talking about me, but I get the sense you feel the same way. If you can help a family with the skills that you develop from when you're in the cops, it's not a big ask, is it?
No, it's not a big ask, because anybody who retires from law enforcement, even if you work in a slow place, you have a tremendous amount of experience that people just don't have. And people are very interested in police work, it's obvious, and because movies and books are written about it. So, and there are people that need your help. And it, it's not like the PI that goes out there and kicks in doors, but you could shed light or look at a situation from a different angle that maybe the police in 1975 didn't see. Maybe they didn't, didn't look at, let's match, it was common to not match a case in one borough with a case in another, where they were almost the same. It was a mirror image of the same thing. Well, that happened 5 miles away. It's a different jurisdiction. That doesn't mean the serial killer knows that. He's doing his work. So you have to relook at it.
And quite often, it's not the failings of the police, it's just the system that was. When I first started investigating homicides, they had cards. There wasn't a computer system, it was cards. So sometimes the mistakes have made, and I always say that investigative opportunities were missed, but the benefit we have now is the benefit of hindsight, looking back and all the DNA, everything that we've got in our favour now, forensic science, that helps with investigations. But would you recommend policing to if someone came to you, a member of your family or some young person that you knew came up to you and said, "I'm thinking of joining the police. I want to be a New York cop." What would your response be to them?
Well, if I know the person, their personality. I would know if they would fit it better. I have a family member that's on the job right now, and I was approached with that exact question. And other people approached, and people even said, "Are you going to talk this person out of it?" I says, "No." I said, "This is what this person wants to do. If you want to be a police officer, there is a job for you there. And if you want to do it, it makes your job a lot easier, far from perfect." And I tell them, it's not going to be an easy job. You're going to have to do a lot that you didn't expect. But if it's what you want to do, you have to go in it, and you have to be your own person and be good at what you do. So I would not talk anybody out of it if it is what they want to do. If their head's in the game, and they want to do that job, I would tell them yes, because I made a good life out of it. I mean, I'm sitting on this podcast with you talking across the world, and very few professions can do this, that it's interesting, they could write about it like me and you did, we wrote about it. So I would suggest it is if it's what you want to do, and it almost as if it was your calling all along. Like, when you watch those movies as a kid and said, I could do that, I could sit in that police car. And if that stays with you over the years, and you're going to college and you're going to I went to school, I thought for education, but I knew I was going to be a cop. So I never once said I wished I was a teacher. I did what I wanted to do, which was police work. So if you have that in you, I would tell a person to take the job, yes.
I like that. I like that advice. What do you think is the qualities of a good cop? What are the qualities you look for when you're a supervisor and you're looking for a team, or you're making up an investigative group? What sort of qualities do you look for in a person to be a good cop?
To be a good cop, you have to really be able to talk to people, talk down a situation, look at something like, okay, this person's drunk. He just told me to F myself. Okay, I'm going to step back. Okay, don't call me to F myself no more. And you say it in a nice way, but you tell him I'm not going to continue with this. But you also understand that, you can't be the tough guy, because if you're the tough guy all the time, it doesn't matter how big you are, somebody's going to eventually punch you in the nose. So you have to realize who's the officer that could talk down a situation. Who's the officer that could tell the hardened criminal, listen, and I've had to do this. I've looked at these guys like, I can't fight this guy, but I could tell him to put his hands behind his back and come with me. And I would say, let's go. Put your hands behind your back. Let's go. I ain't going. Okay, well, I'll call 5 people then, and then you'll have to go. And he's like, all right, I understand. So a good cop knows to look at the situation and doesn't run into it. But when you mentioned investigator, you said something very interesting. You need a different set of skill set. And I was the supervisor investigators. What I noticed, the best investigators were the ones who think outside the box.
Yeah. I'd agree with that. I'd agree with that, because it's anyone can. I say it this with homicide investigations. Anyone can investigate the smoking gun type murder. It's like tracking an elephant through the snow. It's the difficult ones, the protracted ones, the ones that people give up on. I look for the investigators that want to hang in there and just go hard and think outside the square, because you got to be creative in your thinking on what how you're going to go about it. That just brings us about to the end of time of our talk here. Your book, what's the book called, and where can we get it for people that want to hear all the stories of a real live New York cop? And you've listened to him now, so you know he's the real deal. Where can they get access to the book?
Yeah, I'm the real deal. It is 61 short stories.
Oh, we check that out. We only have people with the real deal on the podcast. But yeah, sorry.
There's no AI here. If anyone's writing with AI, please stop. This is, I was the New York City police officer. I did it, and I worked different units that a lot of people never saw or never understood. And I'm writing about stuff that really people don't talk about. All in a day's work and officers' accounts. 20 years NYPD. You get it on Amazon Kindle. It's 61 short stories. They're short from 1 page to 7 page. It's everything from cop humor to the nitty gritty. I left out the gore, so it's It's just funny police stories. There are a lot of investigation work, internal affairs work. There is missing person cases and just stuff on patrol that the truth is stranger than fiction, which means that if you had told me, I wouldn't have believed it, but it happened and I wrote about it in a book.
Yeah. Well, the bits that I've had available to me that I'm reading, they're all interesting stories, and I got to say I can just relate so much to the police, and I've seen that with different areas that I've worked in the police or different jurisdictions, that there's a commonality that runs through policing, whether it's New York or New South Wales, that you understand it. And you mentioned there, and we'll just finish off on the cop humour, because a lot of times I feel, and we spoke about this off camera, you feel bad talking about crime, or you're glorifying crime or whatever. When people are listening to two of us talk and they might think, well, they're laughing, that's a little bit inappropriate. But what I'm at pains to explain to people is that you need to be able to see some light in all the darkness you see as a cop. Otherwise, you're not going to last for 20 years. It's going to wear you down. You've got to find something to hang on to, whether it's a little bit of humour or a little bit of humanity to get you through the darkness. Would you agree on that?
I definitely agree. I saw it in your book too. You need, you're at work and you're dealing with these situations that are thrown at you, and you need the humor behind it. And if you go in with a sense of humor, it's going to be a little easier. You can't be stiff as a board, soldiering on. You can't do that all the time. And when I say cop humor, I don't want anybody to think that we were making jokes in front of family members. That never happens. These cop humor happens in the cars driving away. It happened in the squad room. It was funny because you learn it, you see it, and some movies have it correct. Yeah. And some cops, if you have a sense of humor and then you see a crazy situation and then you start to joke around about it and you drive away just shaking your head, and then sure enough, you're back into a real situation again. And not every situation the cop humor comes in, but you need the cop humor, almost like you're exhaling everything you just saw, and you make light of it, and it almost shows that, okay, here's my thick skin, but at times you have to just, I wrote a lot about that in my book, and sometimes you have to just, wow, that just happened, let's move on, let's go on to something else, and you'll talk about it in a cop humor way.
Yeah, it's a good way of describing it, John. Well, look, thank you so much for the chat, and taking us into the life of a New York cop. I think our listeners are going to find your stories and what you've spoken about fascinating. I also, and I say this to the cops, and thank you for the service to the community. I know what a working cop has to put in and the sacrifices you make. So thanks for making a difference over there, and all the best with your future endeavours.
Great. Thank you for having me on the show. It was a great time.
Enjoyed it. Cheers. Well, John Ferriso didn't disappoint. He's everything I expected a New York cop to be. What an impressive fella, and a good storyteller, and I can imagine he would have been a good cop. And I've got to say, his account of being on the ground on September 11, I've read about that. It's embedded in all our memories. But hearing someone that was there and the experiences firsthand, someone that was on the ground at the time, it was quite chilling. And then his stories of just being a New York cop. I've always had a fascination with New York cops, so it was great to finally sit down and have a chat with one.